The air inside the bank's arcade slave market smelled of fear, sweat, and polished wood. Marie stood on the upper balcony, gripping the iron railing until her knuckles turned white, watching the auction below through eyes that had learned to conceal everything. Her mother, Celeste, stood on the auction block, hands trembling as white men examined her teeth, her arms, her worth. New Orleans in March 1847 was the beating heart of the domestic slave trade, a city where fortunes rose and fell on the bodies of human beings. The port bustled with activity that spoke of commerce and cruelty in equal measure. Ships arrived weekly from Virginia and Maryland, carrying enslaved people who had walked over 1,000 miles in coffles, their ankles chained, their futures sold before they even reached Louisiana's sugar plantations. The auction house buzzed with French, Spanish, and English, languages of commerce spoken interchangeably by men who measured wealth in human flesh, who discussed the price of cotton and sugar and slaves with the same clinical detachment. Bank's Arcade itself was an architectural statement designed to legitimize horror. Built in the previous decade, the three-story brick structure featured arched windows that let in Louisiana sunlight, a covered courtyard where transactions occurred under shelter from the rain, and holding pens on the upper floors where enslaved people waited like livestock before slaughter. The building's respectability was intentional, designed to make the unspeakable acceptable, to disguise the fundamental crime of human trafficking as merely another form of business. Marie's pale skin had granted her passage into a world her mother could never enter. She had married Charles Beaumont, heir to Belmont Plantation, 6 months earlier without revealing the truth that haunted her every breath. She was Celeste's daughter, born light enough to pass, raised in silence and secrecy, taught to erase every trace of her origins. Her complexion was the result of generations of sexual violence. White plantation owners raping enslaved women, producing children whose pale skin offered a cruel form of privilege while their legal status remained enslaved. But secrets in Louisiana had a way of surfacing like bodies in the bayou, like bones that would not stay buried. And today, Charles's father, Master Henri Beaumont, had decided to auction Celeste to settle a gambling debt incurred during a card game at the St. Charles Hotel. $700 lost on a single hand of poker, the accumulated losses of 3 nights of drinking and wagering with cotton merchants and sugar barons. $700 to be recouped by selling a woman who had served his family for 23 years, who had raised his grandchildren without anyone knowing they were her blood. The auctioneer's voice carried across the room, sharp and practiced, the voice of a man who had sold thousands of human beings and would sell thousands more. Lot number 47. Healthy female, approximately 45 years of age. Experienced in household work, laundry, and child-rearing. Strong constitution. No known ailments. Speaks French and English. Opening bid at $600. A hand rose from the crowd, a plantation owner from Avoyelles Parish looking for house servants. Then another, a slave trader who bought in bulk and resold for profit. The price climbed like floodwater rising against levees. $650, $700, $725. Marie felt bile rise in her throat, felt the room spinning, felt Charles's hand on her elbow as he asked if she needed air, his voice concerned but oblivious. She could not answer. She could only watch as her mother's body, the body that had carried her, protected her, sacrificed everything for her, was reduced to numbers shouted by men who would never know her name, never understand what they were destroying, never comprehend that the woman on the block was someone's mother, someone's entire world. If you're watching this, you're about to witness a truth that history tried to bury. Stay with me. Bear witness to what happened when one woman's freedom depended on another woman's chains. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. This is what happened when America built its wealth on stolen lives and called it civilization. The bidding continued with brutal efficiency. A plantation owner from Rapides Parish named Marchand, known for working his field hands to death but treating house servants with relative decency, raised his hand. $750. The auctioneer's assistant recorded the bid in a leather-bound ledger where human beings were catalogued like furniture or livestock. The auctioneer called once, his voice echoing through the arcade. Twice, giving other bidders a final chance. 3 times, the gavel already rising. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, like the space between lightning and thunder, like the seconds before drowning. Sold to Monsieur Marchand of Rapides Parish for $750. The gavel fell with the finality of a coffin lid closing, the sound reverberating through Marie's chest like a physical blow. Celeste's eyes found Marie's across the crowded room, across the distance that separated the auction block from the upper gallery, across the impossible chasm between enslaved and free. There was no accusation in them, no plea for rescue that would destroy them both. Only a look that said, "Live. Survive. Be free for both of us. Remember me when remembering is safe. Forget me when forgetting is necessary. I love you enough to let you go." Marie turned away and vomited into her handkerchief, her body rejecting what her mind could not process. Charles fussed over her, solicitous and concerned, suggesting she had eaten something disagreeable at breakfast, that the heat of the auction house was too much for delicate female constitutions, that they should return to the hotel immediately. He was oblivious to the fact that his wife had just watched her mother sold like livestock, that the woman he had married was the daughter of the woman being led away in chains. Marie allowed him to lead her from the auction house, her legs moving mechanically, one foot in front of the other, her mind fracturing into pieces she would spend the rest of her life trying to reassemble. Behind them, the auction continued. 3 more lots that afternoon, 17 human beings sold, families separated, futures obliterated. The machinery of slavery ground on, indifferent to the suffering it created, sustained by laws that protected property over people, by a society that built its wealth on stolen lives and defended it as necessary, natural, divinely ordained. Behind them, Celeste was led to the slave pen on the 2nd floor where she would wait with 11 others for the journey north to Rapides Parish, to a plantation she had never seen, to work cotton fields until her body gave out, to die far from the daughter who could not save her without destroying them both. The pen was a bare room with barred windows and a wooden floor stained dark from years of human suffering. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, fear, and despair. Celeste sat against the wall next to a young woman named Rhoda who had been sold away from her children in Maryland 6 months earlier. Next to Rhoda sat Baptiste, sold to pay his owner's debts. Next to Baptiste sat a woman whose name no one remembered, who had stopped speaking weeks ago, who stared at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. They would leave in the morning, loaded onto a wagon, driven north along muddy roads, delivered to their new owners like packages, like cargo, like the property Louisiana law defined them to be. Marie returned to her hotel room on Royal Street and lay in darkness, listening to the sounds of New Orleans below. Laughter spilling from taverns, music from street performers, the cries of vendors selling pralines and flowers and fresh oysters. The city carried on, indifferent to her suffering, built on suffering, sustained by suffering it refused to acknowledge. She thought about the moment 6 months earlier when her carefully constructed life began to unravel. She thought about the choices that had led her to this auction house, to this impossible position, to a freedom purchased at the cost of her mother's bondage. She thought about the years of lies and performance and erasure that had brought her to this hotel room where she lay beside a man who did not know her, who could never know her, who would reject her if he knew the truth. And she remembered how it all began. The elaborate deception, the careful construction of a false identity, the transformation from Celeste's daughter into Marie Beaumont, wife of a plantation heir, mistress of Belmont, a woman who did not exist except as a performance so convincing that even she sometimes forgot it was a lie. She remembered, and the remembering was a wound that would never heal. 6 months earlier, on a crisp October morning in 1846, Marie had walked through the grand doors of Belmont Plantation as a bride, her white silk gown trailing behind her on marble floors laid by enslaved craftsmen whose names were never recorded. The house stood 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, surrounded by sugarcane fields that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean, each stalk representing hours of back-breaking labor by hands that would never taste the sweetness they produced. The plantation house itself was an architectural statement, a monument to wealth built on human suffering. White columns rose 3 stories high, their capitals carved with acanthus leaves by craftsmen who received no credit for their artistry, whose skill was appropriated and attributed to white architects who had never touched a chisel. Wide galleries wrapped around the structure, offering shade and breeze to the family, while those who worked the fields labored under a sun that could kill within hours during harvest season. Inside, crystal chandeliers imported from France hung from 15-foot ceilings, their prisms casting rainbows across walls papered with silk that cost more than an enslaved person's lifetime value. The grand staircase curved upward like a promise, its mahogany banister smooth from years of hands gliding over its surface. The drawing room featured furniture upholstered in damask, paintings of Beaumont ancestors who had made their fortunes in sugar and slaves, a piano imported from Vienna where Marie would play for guests and pretend she had learned from European masters rather than from an enslaved woman who played by ear and taught in secret. Charles was kind, naive, a man who inherited privilege without questioning its foundation. At 24, he had never worked a day in his life, never felt hunger, never wondered what it meant that his wealth required the enslavement of 140 human beings whose labor produced everything he enjoyed. He believed Marie was the orphan daughter of a French merchant family from Mobile, Antoine and Isabelle Durand, who had died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1842. The lie had been crafted with the precision of a jeweler setting diamonds, each detail carefully placed to support the others. Marie had documents, forged by a free man of color in New Orleans who specialized in creating identities for those who needed them. She had a backstory memorized down to the smallest detail: her childhood home on Government Street, her father's shipping business, her mother's love of gardening, the way they died within days of each other, burning with fever while she survived. But the lie had begun years earlier, when Celeste, recognizing that her daughter's pale skin offered a chance at escape, had made an impossible decision. She had contacted a free woman of color in New Orleans named Madame Eugenie Deslandes, who ran a boarding house on Rampart Street and specialized in helping light-skinned women pass into white society. The network was underground, whispered about but never openly acknowledged, a fragile system that offered some people escape while leaving millions in bondage. For 3 years, from age 14 to 17, Marie had lived with Madame Deslandes in a house that existed between worlds, officially a boarding house for respectable young women, secretly a finishing school for those learning to pass. She learned which fork to use for fish, how to curtsy without appearing servile, how to discuss Wordsworth and Byron as if she had read them rather than having their plots summarized. She learned to straighten her hair with hot irons that burned her scalp and hands, to avoid the sun that might darken her complexion, to never speak of her family or origins except in carefully rehearsed lies. She learned French pronunciation from a tutor who corrected the Creole inflections that marked her as potentially mixed race. She learned to walk with the posture of someone who had never carried water on her head, never bent in cotton fields, never curtsied to white authority. She learned to hold her hands still rather than gesturing expressively, to keep her voice modulated and soft, to erase every physical marker that might betray her origins. Most importantly, she learned to lie with such conviction that the lie became a kind of truth, a performance so flawless that even she sometimes forgot who she really was. Madame Deslandes taught her that passing was not just about appearance but about belief, about inhabiting the role so completely that doubt became impossible. "You must believe you are white," Madame Deslandes instructed, her own pale skin and gray eyes testament to her expertise in navigating racial boundaries. "Not pretend. Believe. Because the moment you doubt, others will see that doubt and question you. You must be more white than white people, more refined, more cultured, more convinced of your own superiority. That is how you survive." The marriage had been arranged through Madame Deslandes' connections, a network of free people of color, sympathetic whites, and those who profited from facilitating such arrangements. Charles had met Marie at a soirée in New Orleans hosted by a family friend, where she played Chopin on the piano and spoke French with an accent that suggested European education and appeared to be exactly what he wanted: refined, beautiful, cultured, and available. He courted her for 6 months with the enthusiasm of a man who had found a treasure. He brought her flowers, magnolias and camellias picked from gardens maintained by enslaved hands. He took her to the opera, where they sat in boxes overlooking a floor where free people of color were segregated to specific sections, where enslaved people were forbidden entirely. He proposed on a moonlit evening in Jackson Square, slipping a diamond ring onto her finger, a diamond purchased with sugar profits, set in gold mined by enslaved people in South America, a symbol of love built on suffering he could not see. He never questioned her story, never investigated her background, never suspected that the woman he intended to marry was the daughter of a slave who worked on a neighboring plantation, that her documents were forged, that her entire identity was a construction designed to deceive him. The wedding was held at St. Louis Cathedral, the towering church that dominated Jackson Square. Marie wore white silk and carried orange blossoms, walked down an aisle lined with white guests who saw only what they expected to see, a beautiful young woman marrying into a respected family. No one noticed the free woman of color sitting in the back pew, Madame Deslandes, watching her students triumph with satisfaction and sadness, knowing the cost of the freedom Marie had purchased. But every night after the wedding, Marie lay awake remembering her mother's hands, scarred from cotton, sugar, and endless labor. Celeste had sacrificed everything to give Marie this chance at freedom, had sent her away at 14, had spent 3 years without seeing her daughter so that Marie could learn to become someone else. The plantation operated with brutal efficiency that horrified Marie even as she benefited from it. 140 enslaved people worked the sugar fields from dawn until darkness, their labor producing the wealth that filled the Beaumont coffers. During harvest season, October through January, they worked 18-hour days cutting cane with machetes that could slice through flesh as easily as stalks, their hands bleeding from the sharp leaves, their backs bent under the weight of cane that could grow 12 feet high. Children as young as 6 worked in the fields during harvest, learning the rhythm of labor that would define their entire lives. They carried water to the cutters, gathered stalks that fell from wagons, worked the lighter tasks until they were old enough for the heavy labor that would eventually kill them. Life expectancy for an enslaved person working sugar in Louisiana was 7 years from the time they arrived. Shorter than any other form of slavery in the American South, shorter even than slavery in the Caribbean sugar islands. The sugar mill operated day and night during harvest, its machinery crushing cane and boiling juice in massive kettles that could burn a person alive if they fell in. The work was dangerous, exhausting, deadly. People lost limbs to the machinery, died from exhaustion and heat stroke, were worked literally to death and replaced with new purchases from the New Orleans slave market. Marie saw them from her bedroom window each morning. Men and women rising before dawn in the slave quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins arranged in 2 rows behind the main house. The cabins were primitive structures, single rooms housing multiple families, dirt floors, gaps in the walls that let in cold and rain, no furniture except what people made themselves from scraps. The contrast with the main house was obscene. Crystal and silk versus dirt and wood, comfort versus suffering, all separated by a few hundred yards of Louisiana soil. She played her role perfectly, desperately. The dutiful wife, the gracious hostess, the woman who served mint juleps to guests while her mother served in the quarters below. She hosted dinners where plantation owners discussed the price of sugar and the Negro problem with clinical detachment. She listened to wives complain about the difficulty of managing household slaves, about the laziness and ingratitude of people they owned. She heard everyone agree that slavery was a benevolent institution that civilized an inferior race, that enslaved people were better off under white guardianship than free in Africa, that abolitionists were dangerous radicals who threatened Southern prosperity. Marie smiled and nodded and said nothing, her hands trembling beneath the table, her jaw aching from holding her expression neutral, her mind screaming truths she could never speak. At night, when Charles slept the sleep of the unburdened, Marie would sometimes slip out to the slave quarters, moving through darkness like a ghost, like someone who did not exist except in the spaces between worlds. She would find her mother sitting outside her cabin, staring at stars that looked the same whether you were free or enslaved, and they would speak in whispered French about the impossibility of their situation. Celeste never reproached her, never asked why Marie did not confess to Charles, why she did not attempt to buy her mother's freedom, why she continued the charade that kept them separated by a chasm wider than the distance between their beds. "You must survive," Celeste would whisper, her voice barely audible above the night sounds of crickets and frogs. "You must live the life I could never have. That is my gift to you." That is what I chose when I sent you away. Do not throw it away. Do not let my sacrifice be for nothing." But survival came with a cost Marie had not fully calculated. It required constant vigilance, perpetual performance, the erasure of her own history and identity. She could not grieve when other enslaved people died, and they died regularly, from disease, exhaustion, violence, despair. She could not show mercy without raising suspicion. She could not be herself because herself was a secret that could destroy everything. Then Master Henri began to watch her too closely. It started with small comments, observations about her resemblance to certain slaves in the quarters, questions about her family that had no safe answers, looks that lingered too long and saw too much. Henri Beaumont was not a fool. He had managed Belmont Plantation for 40 years, had bought and sold hundreds of enslaved people, had learned to read bodies and bloodlines with the expertise of a slave trader evaluating merchandise. And he suspected, with growing certainty, that his son had married a woman with African blood, that the refined Marie Durand was not what she claimed, that somewhere in her ancestry was the contamination that Louisiana law defined as making her property rather than person. The suspicion was a noose tightening slowly around Marie's neck, a trap closing with the inexorable patience of someone who knew time was on his side. It happened on a Tuesday in March 1847, when the azaleas were blooming pink and white along the plantation's Oak Line Drive, when spring had arrived in Louisiana with its false promise of renewal. A visitor from Mobile arrived at Belmont, a merchant named Jacques Rousseau who claimed to have known Marie's supposed family, the Durands, who had allegedly died in the yellow fever epidemic of 1842. The dinner was formal, held in the main dining room where a mahogany table stretched long enough to seat 16 guests. The table had been imported from England decades earlier, its surface polished to a mirror shine by enslaved servants who would never eat from it. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight from a chandelier that had cost more than most enslaved people would earn in a lifetime if they had been paid for their labor. Silver gleamed against white linen. Forks, knives, spoons arranged in the precise order that marked class and civilization. Enslaved servants moved silently around the table, their faces carefully blank as they served course after course. Oyster soup imported from the Gulf, roasted duck glazed with orange sauce, sweet potatoes candied with sugar produced on the very plantation where they labored. Rousseau was a talker, the kind of man who filled silence with anecdotes and opinions, who dominated conversation with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. He spoke of his business ventures in shipping and cotton, his travels to Cuba and Haiti where he observed different systems of slavery and found Louisiana's comparatively humane, his investments in railroads and banks. He was wealthy, connected, precisely the kind of man whose suspicions could destroy Marie if he chose to voice them. Then, casually, as enslaved hands cleared the main course and prepared to serve dessert, a trifle made with cream and berries and sherry, Rousseau turned to Marie with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Tell me, Madame Beaumont, which branch of the Durand family were you descended from? I knew several families by that name in Mobile. Fine people, all of them." The room contracted. Marie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She recovered quickly, setting it down with practiced grace, her hands steady despite the terror flooding through her veins. "My father was Antoine Durand. He owned a shipping business near the port, dealing primarily in cotton and timber exports to France." "Antoine Durand," Rousseau repeated slowly, his eyes narrowing with the expression of a man solving a puzzle. "I knew an Antoine Durand in Mobile. Died in '43, I believe. But he had no children, only a nephew in Charleston who inherited everything. The estate was quite substantial." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Charles looked confused, glancing between Marie and Rousseau with the expression of a man who sensed something wrong but could not identify what. Master Henri leaned forward, his gaze sharp as a blade, his interest suddenly focused with dangerous intensity. The enslaved servants continued their work, but Marie saw one woman, her mother's friend Josephine, freeze momentarily before continuing to pour wine. Marie felt sweat gathering at the base of her spine, felt the careful architecture of her lies beginning to crack like porcelain under pressure. "Perhaps you're thinking of a different Antoine Durand," she said smoothly, her voice betraying nothing of the panic screaming through her mind. "It's a common enough name in Mobile. There were several families named Durand in the shipping trade." "Perhaps," Rousseau agreed, but his tone suggested he did not believe her. His eyes remained fixed on her face, examining her features with an intensity that made her want to run from the room. "Though I pride myself on remembering the details of my business associates. The Antoine Durand I knew was quite distinctive. Tall man, red hair, spoke with a pronounced stutter. Had a passion for horse racing. No children, as I mentioned. The family line died with him. The trap was springing shut." Marie could feel it, the walls closing in, the lie unraveling, the careful construction of 5 years collapsing under the weight of a stranger's memory. "My father had brown hair and spoke without impediment," she said quietly. "As I said, you must be thinking of someone else." The conversation moved on, forced forward by Charles's intervention, talking about sugar prices and the upcoming harvest, but the damage was done. Henri Beaumont had seen the exchange, had watched Marie's momentary panic, had added this evidence to whatever suspicions he already harbored. That night, after the guests had retired to their rooms, Marie heard raised voices from Master Henry's study, angry male voices echoing through the walls of the house that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a prison. She crept to the door and pressed her ear against the heavy wood, her heart pounding so hard she feared it would be audible. Cannot be certain based on one merchant's memory. That was Charles's voice, defensive, confused, unwilling to believe what his father was suggesting. "I am certain enough." Henry's tone was cold as winter iron, sharp as the edge of an axe. That merchant saw through her story in 5 minutes. How long before others do the same? How long before someone connects her to that mulatto woman in the quarters? Have you looked at them side by side, Charles? Have you seen the resemblance? Marie's blood turned to ice. He knew, or suspected enough that it amounted to the same thing. Suspected enough to act, to eliminate the threat she represented to his family's reputation and standing. "You're being ridiculous," Charles protested, his voice rising with anger and confusion. "Marie is a respectable woman from a good family. Just because some merchant misremembers, she is a liability." Henry's voice cut through his son's objections like a knife through silk. "I don't know exactly what she is, but I know she's not what she claims. And I will not have this family's reputation destroyed by your poor judgment and naivety. I will not have whispers that a Beaumont married a woman with Negro blood, that our grandchildren might carry the taint of slavery." The words hit Marie like physical blows. Taint. Negro blood. The language of Louisiana's racial laws that defined her not as human but as contamination, as pollution that could spread through families and destroy white purity. "What do you propose to do?" Charles asked, his voice quieter now, frightened. "I propose to eliminate the problem before it becomes public. That mulatto woman, Celeste, she's been here too long, knows too much. I'm going to sell her. Remove the evidence before anyone can make the connection." Marie fled back to her room before she could hear more, her mind racing through impossible calculations. If Henri exposed her, Louisiana law was brutal and clear. Anyone with visible African ancestry could be enslaved regardless of their current status. The state had passed multiple acts defining freedom by blood, by documentation, by the willingness of white men to acknowledge or destroy it. Even free people of color lived under constant threat of enslavement through kidnapping, false documentation, or simple accusation by white citizens. The legal precedents were terrifying. Marie knew the stories whispered among those who passed. Sally Miller, a white German woman enslaved for years before winning her freedom through the courts. Countless others who were not so lucky, who were accused of having African blood and found themselves at auction, their protests ignored, their documents declared forgeries, their lives erased. Marie could be stripped of everything. her marriage annulled, her freedom revoked, her body sold at auction like any other piece of property. And if she was pregnant with Charles's child, and she suspected she might be, having missed her monthly courses twice, that child would be born into slavery, would inherit her enslaved status rather than his father's freedom. The next morning, Henri summoned Celeste to the main house. Marie watched from her bedroom window as her mother walked across the yard, her posture straight despite her fear, her hands steady despite knowing what was coming. 30 minutes passed. 30 minutes that felt like hours, like years, like centuries of suffering compressed into half an hour. Then Marie heard the sharp crack of a slap, her mother's cry quickly silenced, the sound of violence that made her want to run downstairs and reveal everything. Consequences be damned. But she could not move, could not speak, could not do anything except stand at the window and watch as her mother emerged from the house, her lip bleeding, her left eye already beginning to swell with a bruise that would darken to purple within hours. Celeste did not look up at the window where she knew her daughter watched, did not acknowledge Marie's presence in any way, simply walked back across the yard to the quarters with her head high, refusing to give Henri the satisfaction of seeing her broken. That night, Marie slipped out to find her mother sitting on the rough wooden bench outside her cabin, gently touching her swollen lip, her eye nearly closed from swelling. "What did he say?" Marie whispered urgently, kneeling beside her mother in the darkness. Celeste touched her injured lip gently, wincing. "He asked about you. About any children I might have had. Any daughters born light enough to pass. Any connections to women who married into white families." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I had a daughter who died years ago. Of fever, when she was 12. Celeste's eyes met Marie's in the darkness, reflecting starlight and resignation. "But he doesn't believe me. He sees the resemblance between us. He knows or suspects enough to be dangerous. He's going to sell me, Sherry. He's going to remove the evidence before it can implicate you, before it can destroy Charles's marriage and the family's reputation." "No." Marie's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "I won't let him. I'll tell Charles everything. I'll confess. I'll buy you. You'll do nothing." Celeste gripped her daughter's hands with surprising strength, her fingers pressing hard enough to leave marks. "If you confess, you destroy yourself. If you tell Charles, he might believe you and divorce you, leaving you vulnerable to being enslaved. Or he might not believe you and his father will have you both sold to separate plantations. And my sacrifice, sending you away, teaching you to pass, giving you this chance at freedom, will have been for nothing. Do you understand? For nothing." Marie understood, but understanding did not make it bearable, did not make it possible to accept that she would watch her mother sold while she stood silent, that she would maintain her lie while the only person who truly knew her was taken away forever. "I can't," Marie whispered. "Maman, I can't do this." "You can. You will. Because you must survive. Because you will have children who deserve freedom, who deserve lives without chains. Because my mother, your grandmother, died in those fields before I turned 10, and her mother before her, and we have carried this suffering for generations. You are the first who has a chance to break free. Do not throw that away. Live for all of us who could not. Remember us when it is safe to remember. Forget us when forgetting is necessary for survival." 2 days later, Henri made his announcement at breakfast, casually, as if discussing the weather or the price of cotton. "I'm settling some debts," he said, buttering his bread with mechanical precision. "Taking a few slaves to auction in New Orleans next week. That woman Celeste among them. She's getting old, less useful than she once was. Might as well get something for her while she's still worth something to someone." Marie's fork clattered against her plate, the sound echoing in the sudden silence like a gunshot. Charles glanced at her, concerned but oblivious. "Are you well, darling?" She could not speak. Her throat had closed. Her vision had narrowed to a tunnel. Her hands shook so violently she had to hide them in her lap, pressing them against her thighs hard enough to bruise. "I'm fine," she managed finally. "Just a moment of dizziness. Perhaps I'm with child." The lie distracted Charles immediately. The possibility of an heir, of continuing the Beaumont line, of his own immortality through children. He fussed over her, suggesting she rest, calling for water, his excitement palpable. Henri watched the performance with cold satisfaction. He knew. He might not be able to prove it in a court of law, but he knew. And he was eliminating the problem the only way he could, by removing Celeste from the equation entirely, by destroying the evidence of Marie's origins before it could destroy his family. Marie had 5 days before the auction. 5 days to save her mother without destroying herself. 5 days to perform a miracle in a world where miracles were reserved for white people, and she was not quite white enough to qualify. Master Henri departed for New Orleans on Monday morning, March 8, 1847, with a coffle of 12 enslaved people, including Celeste. The morning was cold for Louisiana, a chill wind blowing from the north that cut through thin clothing and reminded everyone that even in the deep south, winter had teeth. They assembled in the yard behind the main house at dawn, 12 human beings about to be transported to market like livestock, like cargo, like the property Louisiana law defined them to be. They were chained for the journey, iron shackles connecting their ankles in pairs, forcing them to move in rhythm or risk falling, the metal heavy enough to chafe skin raw within hours. The chains were old, used for decades to transport enslaved people from plantation to market, their surfaces smooth from years of friction against human flesh. Each link represented suffering that could not be quantified, distance walked in bondage, the slow erosion of hope. Celeste was paired with a young woman named Rhoda, barely 20, who had been brought from Maryland just 6 months earlier in one of the massive coffles that walked over 1,000 miles from the upper south to Louisiana's sugar country. Rhoda had been sold away from her children, 2 boys, ages 4 and 6, who were purchased by different owners and scattered across Maryland before she was put in the coffle heading south. She carried their names like prayers, Thomas and Samuel. She whispered about them constantly, asking questions that had no answers. "Do you think they remember me?" Rhoda asked as they began walking, the chains between them clinking with each step, creating a rhythm that would accompany them for 2 days. Celeste wanted to offer comfort, but lies seemed cruel when they had so little left to hold on to. "Yes," she said simply, honestly. "They remember." Children always remember their mothers, even when memory is all they have left. The coffle moved slowly, 12 people chained in pairs, walking behind a wagon that carried Henri and his overseer, a brutal man named Dalton who carried a whip and used it liberally on anyone who stumbled or slowed the pace. The road from Belmont to New Orleans wound through the heart of Louisiana's plantation country, a landscape that looked pastoral from a distance but revealed its horror upon closer examination. They passed fields of sugar cane ready for harvest, the stalks standing tall and green, hiding the suffering required to cultivate them. They passed cotton plantations where enslaved people moved in long lines, picking white bowls under the watchful eyes of overseers on horseback, their bags growing heavier with each passing hour until their shoulders screamed and their backs bent under weight that would eventually break them. They passed grand houses set back from the road behind oak trees draped with Spanish moss. Monuments to wealth that were really monuments to theft, to labor stolen, to lives consumed for profit. The landscape was beautiful in the way that poisonous things can be beautiful. Lovely on the surface, deadly beneath. The oaks were magnificent, their branches spreading wide to create tunnels of green shade. The plantation houses were architectural marvels, designed to impress and intimidate. But all of it was built on blood, watered with tears, sustained by suffering that the beautiful facade was designed to hide. They stopped for the night at a slave pen outside Donaldsonville, a way station for traders moving human cargo to New Orleans markets. The pen was a wooden structure surrounded by a high fence topped with sharpened stakes, designed to prevent escape, though escape was nearly impossible with ankle chains and armed guards. Inside, the pen was divided into compartments. Men separated from women, children huddled with mothers who would be sold away from them in a matter of days. The enslaved people were given corn mush and water, minimal sustenance, just enough to keep them alive and presentable for auction. Food was an expense that slave traders minimized, calculating the precise amount needed to prevent death or visible weakness without wasting resources on people who were temporary assets, inventory to be liquidated. They ate with their hands from wooden bowls, sitting on the dirt floor of the pen, their chains making every movement awkward and uncomfortable. Henri and Dalton slept at a nearby inn, leaving the enslaved people locked in for the night under the watch of the pen's owner, a man who made his living charging traders for temporary housing of human cargo. The pen smelled of unwashed bodies, excrement from the rudimentary latrine in the corner, fear and despair that had soaked into the wooden walls over years of use. Celeste lay on the wooden floor, her body aching from the day's walk, her ankle raw where the shackle had rubbed, her mind consumed with thoughts of Marie. By now, her daughter would have convinced Charles to take her to New Orleans under some pretense. Shopping for the baby she had hinted at, visiting friends, attending the theater, anything to be in the city when the auction took place. Celeste knew Marie would come, knew she would watch, knew it would destroy something fundamental in her daughter's soul. A man named Baptiste, being sold to pay his owner's gambling debts, spoke into the darkness. "Where they taking you?" "Wherever the auction sends me," Celeste answered. "New owner, new plantation, same chains, different place." "I heard Marchand's looking for house servants," another voice offered from across the pen. "He got a cotton plantation up in Rapides Parish. They say he works his field hands to death inside of 5 years, but treats the house servants decent. Gives them shoes in winter, doesn't beat them unless they steal or run." Decent. The word was laughable, obscene. As if there was such a thing as decent slavery, as if some chains were better than others, as if kindness could erase the fundamental crime of owning another human being. But this was how enslaved people survived, by measuring degrees of suffering, by hoping for masters who were less brutal rather than dreaming of freedom that seemed impossible, by finding small mercies in a system designed to destroy them. Rhoda whispered about her sons again, her voice breaking. Thomas liked to sing. Samuel was afraid of storms. "I wonder if they're together wherever they are. I wonder if anyone sings to Thomas now. I wonder if someone holds Samuel when it thunders." Celeste had no answers. She simply reached through the darkness and found Rhoda's hand, held it while the young woman cried silently, offering the only comfort available. Presence, witness, the acknowledgement that her children were real, that her loss mattered, that she was not alone in her suffering. They arrived in New Orleans on Wednesday afternoon, March 10, 1847. The city rose before them as they approached from the river road, a dense collection of buildings pressed against the Mississippi, church spires pointing toward a God who seemed not to notice the suffering below, the sounds and smells of a thriving port city that had built its prosperity on the domestic slave trade. The French Quarter bustled with activity visible even from a distance. Merchants hawking goods in French and Spanish and English, carriages rattling over cobblestones, music spilling from taverns even in afternoon light, street vendors selling oysters and pralines and fresh flowers to people who could afford such luxuries. But the coffle did not enter the quarter, did not see the famous Jackson Square or the elegant townhouses with their iron balconies and hidden courtyards. Instead, they were taken directly to Banks Arcade on Magazine Street, the largest slave market in New Orleans, a 3-story brick structure that processed thousands of human beings annually and generated enormous profits for its owners. The arcade was designed to look respectable from the outside. Arched windows, covered courtyard, architectural details that suggested refinement and civilization rather than horror and degradation. The enslaved people were taken to the holding pens on the second floor, bare rooms with barred windows and wooden floors stained dark from years of suffering. The chains were finally removed, leaving deep marks on ankles, the sudden lightness almost disorienting after 2 days of constant weight. They were given water and more corn mush, told to wash themselves as best they could in the buckets provided, informed that the auction would take place in 2 days and they needed to look presentable. A man named Theophilus Beard, the chief auctioneer at Banks Arcade, examined them one by one, recording their attributes in a leather-bound ledger where human beings were catalogued with the same attention to detail that merchants gave to shipments of cotton or sugar. He was efficient, practiced, a man who had sold thousands of people and would sell thousands more, who had learned to evaluate human beings as merchandise without seeing their humanity. He looked at Celeste's teeth, checking for cavities or missing teeth that would lower her value. He felt her arms and shoulders for muscle tone that indicated work capacity. He asked intrusive questions about her health and childbearing history, questions designed to assess her worth as property. "Any children?" he asked, his pen poised over the ledger. "One," Celeste lied, her voice steady. "Died years ago of fever." "Medical problems? Illnesses? Injuries that affect your work?" "No." "Can you read or write?" "No." Another lie. She could read French and some English, could write her name and simple phrases, skills taught to her years ago by a previous owner's daughter who had been kind before she married and moved away. But literacy made enslaved people dangerous, increased the risk of escape or rebellion, made them less desirable to many buyers who wanted ignorant laborers rather than educated people who might question their bondage. Beard made notes in his ledger with practiced strokes. Female, mulatto, approximately 45 years, good health, experienced house servant, French and English speaking, suitable for household work or supervision of field hands. Estimated value: $700 to $800. $700 to $800. The sum of her life reduced to a figure in a ledger, her worth measured in the same way men measured livestock or furniture, her humanity erased and replaced with a price tag that would determine who owned her next. That night, Celeste sat with the others in the holding pen, waiting for sleep that would not come. Through the barred window, she could see the lights of New Orleans. Gas lamps illuminating streets where free people walked, taverns where music played, a world that existed parallel to this one but separated by an unbridgeable chasm of freedom and bondage. Meanwhile, Marie had convinced Charles to bring her to the city, pleading that she needed supplies for the baby she claimed to be carrying, that she wanted to consult with a New Orleans physician who was renowned for his care of pregnant women. Charles, delighted at the prospect of fatherhood, agreed immediately. They stayed at a hotel on Royal Street in the French Quarter, in a room with tall windows overlooking the elegant street, surrounded by the luxury that sugar profits provided. Marie could not sleep, could not eat, could barely maintain the performance of normalcy that her survival required. Charles attributed her distress to pregnancy, to female vapors, to the delicate constitution he believed all refined women possessed. He suggested she rest, offered to conduct their business alone, worried about her health with the tender concern of a man who genuinely cared for the woman he believed was carrying his child. The night before the auction, Marie walked alone through the French Quarter to the slave pen. She could not enter. White women did not visit slave markets except during auctions, but she stood across the street from Banks Arcade, staring at the barred windows on the second floor where light flickered from oil lamps, hoping her mother could feel her presence across the distance that separated them. Inside, Celeste stood at the window, looking out at the city that would determine her fate. She saw a figure across the street, a woman in a dark cloak, her pale face barely visible in the gaslight, and knew without seeing clearly that it was Marie. She pressed her hand against the cold iron bars, a gesture that could have meant anything or nothing, and watched as the figure across the street raised her own hand in response. This was goodbye. Not the goodbye they had shared in the quarters at Belmont, but the real one. The moment when they acknowledged that tomorrow would separate them forever, that whatever happened at the auction, they would not see each other again in this life. The acknowledgement passed between them without words, carried on the connection that bound mother and daughter across the unbridgeable chasm of slavery and freedom. Marie stood in the street for an hour, watching the window, memorizing the shape of her mother's silhouette, storing this final image against the years of forgetting that lay ahead. Then she turned and walked back to the hotel, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, her heart breaking in ways she could not acknowledge without destroying herself. She returned to the hotel room where Charles slept peacefully, his breathing steady with the innocence of someone who had never suffered, who had never had to choose between survival and love, who existed in a world where freedom was guaranteed and family was secure. She lay beside him in the darkness and did not sleep, staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until dawn, until the auction, until the moment when she would watch her mother sold and maintain the performance that kept her safe. At dawn, she rose and dressed in her finest gown. Green silk with black lace, purchased with money earned from the labor of enslaved people, fashionable and expensive and beautiful in a way that mocked everything she was about to witness. She arranged her hair with trembling hands, applied powder to her already pale skin, and prepared to perform the greatest deception of her life, appearing unmoved while her world ended. The auction was scheduled for noon, Friday, March 13, 1847. The date would be burned into Marie's memory forever. Unlucky 13, the day everything was lost. The bank's arcade filled with buyers beginning at 11:30 on March 13, 1847. They arrived in carriages and on foot. Plantation owners dressed in fine suits, slave traders with the calculating eyes of men who bought and sold human flesh for profit, speculators looking for bargains they could resell at markup. They gathered in the covered courtyard where auctions took place, speaking in French and Spanish and English about crops and weather and prices, about the value of field hands versus house servants, about the best strategies for breaking in new slaves. The atmosphere was businesslike, even casual. Men smoked cigars and discussed politics while they waited. The war with Mexico that had just ended, the question of whether new territories would be slave or free, the threat that abolitionists posed to Southern prosperity. Some brought their sons to teach them the business of slavery, to educate the next generation in the evaluation and purchase of human property. Marie stood beside Charles on the upper gallery, her face composed in an expression of mild interest, her hands hidden in her shawl so no one could see them trembling violently. From this vantage point, she could see everything. The auction block in the center of the courtyard, the crowd of buyers gathered around it, the door where enslaved people would be brought out one by one to be examined and sold. The auction began promptly at noon. Theophilus Beard, the auctioneer, took his position on a raised platform beside the block, his assistant standing ready with a ledger that recorded each sale. Beard was a showman, practiced in the art of selling human beings, skilled at highlighting their attributes and minimizing their flaws to extract the highest possible price. "Gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "we have excellent merchandise today. Strong field hands, skilled craftsmen, experienced house servants. Let us begin." The first person brought to the block was a young man, perhaps 20, with powerful shoulders and muscular arms that marked him as a field worker. He stared at the floor as white hands examined him, touching his arms, checking his teeth, demanding he open his mouth, turn around, demonstrate his strength by lifting heavy sacks. "Strong buck, suitable for heavy labor," Beard announced. Opening bid $500. The bidding was brisk. Hands rose across the courtyard, men calling out numbers with the same tone they would use to bid on cattle or horses. The price climbed, $550, $600, $650. Sold for $700 to a plantation owner from Avoyelles Parish who needed field hands for cotton picking. The young man was led away, his face still blank, his future decided in less than 5 minutes. Another person was brought to the block, a woman this time, middle-aged, described as experienced in cooking and laundry. Then a man skilled in carpentry. Then a girl barely 14, whose youth and appearance drew leering comments from some buyers that made Marie want to vomit. One by one, human beings were auctioned. Families were separated despite promises recorded in the ledger to keep them together. A mother sold to one buyer, her children to another, their cries ignored as they were dragged in different directions. An older couple who had been enslaved together for 30 years were split up, the man going to a sugar plantation, the woman to a household in the city, both understanding they would never see each other again. The crowd watched with detached interest, calculating value, weighing options, treating human suffering as merely the cost of doing business. Some ate food brought by vendors, oysters and sandwiches consumed while people's lives were destroyed. Some joked with friends, catching up on social news between bids. The room smelled of tobacco and cologne and expensive fabric, the scent of wealth built on stolen lives. Marie felt the room spinning, felt nausea rising, felt her consciousness fragmenting under the weight of what she was witnessing. But she could not look away, could not excuse herself, could not do anything that would draw attention or raise questions. She had to stand there, had to watch, had to maintain the performance of a woman slightly bored by a mundane commercial transaction. Then they brought Celeste to the block. Marie's vision tunneled. The crowd, the noise, everything faded except her mother standing on that wooden platform, her head high, her hands steady despite the fear Marie knew she must be feeling. Celeste wore a plain cotton dress, clean but worn, her hair covered with a tignon as free women of color wore, but enslaved women were often required to wear, a cloth that marked status and attempted to diminish beauty that white society found threatening. She stood with dignity that no amount of degradation could erase, with the bearing of someone who knew her worth even as others reduced her to a price. "Lot 47, Beard announced, consulting his ledger. "Healthy female, mulatto, approximately 45 years of age. Experienced in household work, laundry, cooking, and child-rearing. Speaks French and English. Strong constitution. No known ailments. Opening bid $600. A hand rose from the crowd, a plantation owner from Avoyelles Parish. Then another, a city merchant looking for household help. The price began to climb as buyers evaluated the woman on the block, discussing her worth as they would discuss the value of furniture or livestock. Celeste's eyes searched the crowd, found Marie standing on the upper gallery. For a moment, just a moment, their gazes locked. There was no anger in Celeste's eyes. No accusation. No plea for rescue that would destroy them both. Only love. Only acceptance. Only permission to survive. Marie felt tears gathering but could not let them fall. Felt her throat closing but could not make a sound. Felt her heart breaking but could not show any emotion that would reveal the connection, that would expose the secret, that would destroy the life her mother had sacrificed everything to give her. The bidding continued. $650. $700. A brief pause. Then a new hand rose. Marchand, the cotton plantation owner from Rapides Parish whose reputation preceded him. $725. Another pause. The other bidders considered whether to continue, whether this particular slave was worth more investment. The auctioneer waited, giving them time, building the tension that might prompt a higher bid. $750, Marchand called out, his voice carrying across the courtyard, finalizing his offer with an amount that discouraged further competition. Beard looked around the crowd, seeking other bids. $750 once. His voice was practiced, rhythmic, the cadence of countless auctions. $750 twice. The gavel rising, poised for the fall that would seal Celeste's fate. Marie wanted to scream, wanted to run down the stairs and stop the auction, to confess everything, to buy her mother herself regardless of the consequences. But her voice was frozen, her body paralyzed, her survival instinct overriding her desire to save the person she loved most in the world. Sold. The gavel fell with the finality of a coffin lid closing, the sound reverberating through Marie's chest like a physical blow. To Monsieur Marchand of Rapides Parish for $750. Celeste's eyes found Marie's one last time. Her lips moved, forming words Marie could not hear but understood. I love you. Be free. Survive. Then she was led away by Marchand's agent, disappearing through the door that led to the holding pens where she would wait for the journey north to a plantation she had never seen, to work cotton fields under a Louisiana sun that would eventually kill her. Marie turned away and vomited into her handkerchief, her body rejecting what her mind could not process. Charles fussed over her immediately, solicitous and alarmed, suggesting they leave, that the auction house air was unwholesome, that pregnant women should not be exposed to such unpleasant scenes. "Let me take you back to the hotel," he urged, his hand on her elbow, guiding her toward the stairs. She allowed him to lead her away, her legs moving mechanically, one foot in front of the other, her mind fragmenting into pieces that would never fully reassemble. Behind them, the auction continued. 3 more lots that afternoon. 17 human beings sold in total. Families separated, futures obliterated. The machinery of slavery ground on, indifferent to the suffering it created, sustained by laws that protected property over people, by a society that built its wealth on stolen lives and defended it as divinely ordained. They returned to the hotel on Royal Street. Charles helped Marie to their room, settled her on the bed, called for water and cool cloths. His concern genuine even as he remained completely oblivious to the real cause of her distress. "Rest, darling," he said softly. "We'll consult with the physician tomorrow about the baby. Everything will be well." But nothing would ever be well again. Marie lay in the darkened room after Charles left to conduct business, staring at the ceiling, replaying the auction in her mind. Her mother's face, the sound of the gavel, the moment when $750 purchased the only person who truly knew her. She had made a choice long ago, to pass, to escape, to accept her mother's sacrifice and live free. Today she had lived with that choice in its fullest, most brutal reality. She had stood silent while her mother was sold. She had maintained her performance while her world ended. She had chosen survival over truth, freedom over family, herself over the woman who had given her life. The guilt would never leave her. The weight of that silence would crush her for the rest of her life. But she would survive, as her mother had demanded. She would honor the sacrifice by living, by bearing children who would be free, by ensuring that Celeste's suffering purchased something more than just one woman's escape. That night, Marie made a decision. She would never speak of this day, would never acknowledge what she had witnessed, would bury the memory so deep that even she could barely access it, would perform whiteness so thoroughly that even she would sometimes forget it was a performance. But in the deepest part of herself, the part that no performance could reach, she would remember, would carry her mother's name like a prayer, would honor the sacrifice by surviving, by living the life Celeste could never have, by bearing witness even if that witness remained silent for decades. The years that followed were marked by silence, heavy, suffocating, absolute. Marie returned to Belmont Plantation, where life continued as if nothing had changed. The sugar cane grew and was harvested. The household operated with brutal efficiency. The Beaumont wealth accumulated while those who created it remained in bondage. Marie gave birth to a son in November 1847, 8 months after the auction. She named him Charles, after his father, watching with anguish as her husband celebrated an heir whose freedom was guaranteed by the lie she maintained with every breath. The baby's pale skin erased any trace of African ancestry, his existence both triumph and tragedy. Proof that her mother's sacrifice had worked, but also a reminder of what that success had cost. She played her role with renewed desperation. She hosted dinners where plantation owners discussed the expansion of slavery, where politicians debated laws that would make escape even more dangerous. She listened to white women complain about their slaves while saying nothing, performing her part in the theater that sustained her freedom. But at night, she wrote letters to Marchand's plantation, carefully worded inquiries about purchasing a slave named Celeste. Most went unanswered. In August 1850, 3 years after the auction, a reply finally came. The Negro woman Celeste died of fever last month, buried in the plantation cemetery with others of her kind. Marie burned the letter in the fireplace, watching her mother disappear into ash just as she had disappeared into an unmarked grave. She could not grieve publicly, could not acknowledge the loss without revealing everything. So she mourned in silence, planting a magnolia tree in the garden as a memorial to a woman whose name she could never speak. In 1852, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Celeste, hiding the memorial in plain sight. No one questioned it. No one suspected. The secret remained locked inside her heart, growing heavier with each passing year. That same year, Master Henri died. On his deathbed, he called Marie to his side and whispered, "I always knew about you, about her. But you played the game well." Marie stood over him, feeling nothing. She died thinking of her daughter, she said quietly. "You were not important enough to hate." It was the only revenge she would ever have, denying him significance in his final moments. She walked out and left him to die alone. She began keeping a journal in 1855, writing in French, hiding it beneath the floorboards. She recorded everything she could not speak: her mother's name, their history, the truth of her existence. "I am neither white nor black in this world, but something in between, a ghost who walks among the living, a woman who lost her mother to save herself. I do not know if I will ever forgive myself, but I will survive. I will remember." When the Civil War began in 1861, Charles enlisted in the Confederate Army and left Belmont in Marie's care. She hoped the Union would win, that slavery would end, but she also feared what questions freedom might bring about her past. Charles died at Port Hudson in 1863. Marie felt sadness. He had been kind in his way, but also strange liberation. For 16 years, she had lived with a man who did not know her. Now she was alone with her secrets. When Union soldiers arrived at Belmont in 1865, Marie watched as enslaved people left, some immediately, others with nowhere to go. She did not reveal she was Celeste's daughter. Some secrets remained too dangerous even after slavery ended. The plantation failed without enslaved labor. Marie sold it in 1868 and moved to New Orleans with her daughter. She watched as Louisiana implemented black codes and white supremacist violence, as the promise of freedom gave way to Jim Crow segregation. She saw that her grandchildren would navigate a world only marginally better than the one she had known. She never told her children the truth. She took the secret to her grave in 1889, buried in St. Louis Cemetery, her headstone reading, "Marie Beaumont, beloved mother and grandmother." But before she died, she gave her journal to Josephine Laveau, a free woman of color who had been her friend for 30 years. "Keep this," Marie said. "Let it speak when I cannot. Tell our story when it's safe to tell." The journal remained hidden until 1947, exactly 100 years after Celeste stood on the auction block. A historian discovered it in an attic trunk, its pages yellowed but legible, its story preserved through generations of silence. Marie's story is not unique. Thousands navigated the brutal realities of passing, of families divided by racial fiction, of mothers who sacrificed everything for their children's freedom. These stories matter because they reveal the arbitrary cruelty of racial categories, the violence required to maintain a system that divided people into human and property based on appearance. This is not a story with a happy ending. This is a story about survival when all options lead to loss, when saving yourself means losing everyone you love, when freedom requires betrayal, when survival demands silence. Marie passed as white for 43 years. She married a plantation heir. She watched her mother sold for $750 on March 13, 1847. She carried that weight until 1889, a truth that could never be spoken, a grief never acknowledged, a love that transcended every boundary slavery imposed. Her mother's name was Celeste. She was sold to Marchand of Rapides Parish. She died in August 1850, buried in an unmarked grave with others whose names were never recorded, whose lives were never valued, whose stories were nearly lost. But Marie remembered. She wrote it down. She preserved what could not be spoken. And now we know Celeste's story too. Remember them. Remember all of them. The mothers who sacrificed. The daughters who survived. The families torn apart. Remember that this happened. That people endured the unendurable, loved despite the cost, survived against every odd. Remember, because forgetting is another form of erasure, another kind of death, another victory for the system that tried to destroy them. Their lives mattered. Their stories matter. And the truth, no matter how painful, no matter how long it remained hidden, must be told. This is their testimony. This is their witness. This is what remains when everything else has been taken. The truth that survives silence, the love that transcends death, the memory that refuses to be erased. Remember.